Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you this morning.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing fine.
Good.
And want to talk once again about Afghanistan.
Yeah, it's in the news.
We've discussed it a little bit in recent weeks and months, kept our fingers crossed, and always hoped those instincts that we believe that Trump has, that he would like to stop a war now and then, and that these negotiations would get somewhere. But all of a sudden on Saturday, they fell apart, and we're back to square one. There's really nothing going on. Maybe it's a real setback. And that's been in the news, and of course Pompeo was interviewed on all the news stations yesterday morning, and he didn't have much encouragement. I think he'd like to be looking like he's an ally of the president, but I know where his heart really is. But we also know that Bolton is involved. So even though there looked like there was supposed to be some agreement and some backing off and maybe us coming home, Bolton didn't like that idea. And if there's anybody putting in monkey wrenches, he's still around, and that's really a question that one should have. If the president is truly wanting to move in the direction that we advise and that we would like to see, you wouldn't have an advisor like Bolton. So how much Bolton did on the weekend, we don't know exactly. But anyway, the reason why the talks were stalled was the fact that there was a bombing and 12 innocent people were killed, Afghans, but one American soldier. And therefore, that was the excuse. That really wasn't the reason. That was the excuse because they were going to stop. They just decided it wouldn't work because there was too much political heat, coming over here. The Republicans, Democrats, sort of work together when it comes to foreign policy. So the Republican and Democratic leadership were outraged. How can you bring the Taliban? And they raised some legitimate questions, but not for the same reasons we would. It really, in some ways, doesn't make a whole lot of sense that all of a sudden you're going to get the Taliban to end a war that's never been declared, and we don't know why we're there, and they're not our enemies. They didn't attack us, and all these things. So this whole idea that all we had to do was bring the Taliban over here. So it was to me a little bit naive. But anyway, it was stopped, and I think this means that the neoconservatives had a victory over the weekend.
Yeah, and as usual, their victory will be a Pyrrhic one, to say the least. But the Camp David meeting, this is what it's all about. The idea, apparently, and this is the New York Times has written about it for what it's worth, but this is apparently what happened, is that President Trump had an idea. Why don't we go ahead and set up a meeting at Camp David, the famous place, famous retreat of presidents, the famous, remember, the Carter meeting for the Israel peace plan, Israel-Egypt peace plan. Get together there. We've got the Taliban. We'll bring in the Afghan president, Ghani. We'll bring him in too. The three of us will stand there with the photo op. It'll show that I've just hammered out the final details of the deal myself, and we'll all sign it, and it'll be sort of a made-for-TV, made-for-re-election campaign sort of moment. But unfortunately, this is where the showman meets the real world. The showman in him thought that would be great optics. But the real world says, this is difficult. You're bringing in the Taliban a couple of days before 9/11. The timing is not great. And the Taliban says, we don't want to come over here to be a prop in your re-election campaign. We want the deal signed completely before we come over. Then maybe we'll come on over and have a photo op with you. So the whole thing really had kind of failure printed on it from the beginning. And unsurprisingly, it fell apart. But now the question we're going to try to unpack in this show, if we can do it, is what happens next? This is 8 months of hard negotiation in Qatar between Khalilzad, our negotiator, and the Taliban. The deal was put together, ready to be signed. So what happens now?
Well, I've never been optimistic that there was going to be a magic wand and it was going to end and we were going to come home. But even this negotiation involved us staying in a significant number. We weren't going to leave. We still wanted our footprint there. And the other thing is I think there's many now that have concluded that we've lost the war. When you think about the Taliban has recovered their homeland to a large degree, and if you compare it to the time from 2001, they've had a 75% increase in control of land. Yeah. So they've done a very good job, in spite of all our bombing and killing and loss of lives, both Afghans and as well as Americans. And it's done the reverse. And I think it goes back to the question, what was the justification for 2001? Was there really a justification? It turns out, if people are honest with themselves, it wasn't like the Taliban had something to do with 9/11, and all of a sudden they go right to the Taliban, and now there's more information coming out every year, every month, on the relationship of 9/11 and Saudi Arabia, and that's been ignored. But no, it was for other reasons, political reasons, strategic reasons, financial reasons, oil reasons, pipelines. That this gives us our chance. We got to go in there. So it was going in for the wrong reason, and of course they sent some people, the people that represented us, forgot to read their history. They should have just remembered a little history, remembered the Soviet system. The Soviet Union didn't do so well there, and yet onward and they go, thinking it'll be different this time. And even with these negotiations, they didn't say, think we made a bad mistake, And if you come to that conclusion, then the approach is completely different. Then you would suggest, well, if really we don't need it for national security, we've lost the war, do you think we ought to just gracefully slip out the back door and just forget about this? Because the people negotiating there, I just didn't think that it would be likely to bring about eternal peace.
Yeah. Well, I'd just like to draw a line under something that you said when you started out just now, because I think this is important to hammer home. You said, and it's the correct point, that the longer we were fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan, the more ground they actually took over. So our presence there is actually helped the Taliban take over territory. And this shouldn't be surprising to people that understand, you've talked a lot about what Robert Pape writes, and it's related, not exactly, but related. The presence of foreign troops on your soil is a great recruiting ground. That's why we got the troops out of Saudi Arabia in the first place after the Iraq War. So our being there helps the Taliban get stronger. And if you're really feeling a little conspiratorial, you might wonder, maybe that's just what Washington likes. Maybe that's what the blob likes.
And it isn't just two groups negotiating. I mean, what we hear about is the Taliban and the U.S., they have to come up with an agreement because we have still some military might to contend with. We still have some money left. And the Taliban has the homeland that they're going to defend. So the negotiations were between the Taliban and the U.S. But, there was not as much mention about the Afghan government. I mean, they've been sort of lost in this thing. They still exist. And to me, if you look at this on the surface, if there's a problem there and we take the proper position that it's not our business, then it would be the government that's not Taliban negotiating, working on something with the Taliban, which happens in the past, that has existed. But then not only do we have three groups involved there, when you put the Afghan government, U.S. and Taliban together, you have to deal with the U.S. media.
Yeah.
The media was a big issue this weekend. You mean you would have people from the Taliban come over here and step on our soil? I mean, what patriotic American would ever accept this? Well, I didn't accept it because I didn't think it was wise, but the media had a different goal. It was to destroy any hint that people would talk about peace. And then you have a little bit more behind the scenes who's in this argument too, are the neoconservatives in the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
I mean, they're there. I mean, they have their representation in the administration, but they're a very powerful force, because if peace broke out, my goodness, we wouldn't have nearly the need to build all these weapons that don't work. I mean, this way we keep building weapons, they don't work, but then you need more. You have to repair them. So it is a mess. I would say that our 18 years hasn't accomplished much, and you reiterated the fact that it probably was a negative. It probably did opposite of what was intended, and it's still a big mess. And these negotiations didn't work for various reasons, and I see that there could be hope for Afghanistan to some degree, but it would require one little change in policy. Just come home for the United States troops. And I think things would settle down. That's what we had to do in Vietnam, and things got better.
The whole negotiations, these 8 months of negotiations, is remarkable for one main fact, that the Afghan government, the government that we put in there, they were not involved at all. They were simply not a player. Talk about humiliation. The President Ghani, he's facing a re-election campaign. I think the elections are the 28th of this month. And he was put out there to dry because he's not involved in the negotiations. So he doesn't even look like he has any power in his own country. He's trapped. He had to sort of go along with it, make all the right sounds about the peace talks, because otherwise he would be seen as an impediment to peace. So it's really amazing how he's been hung out to dry in this whole thing. You talked about the media too, and I was just going to mention Lindsey Graham, who played a big role over the weekend. Of course, he goes on to all the shows, and they open seat for him. Come in, have a seat, talking about how this is terrible, that we're going to take any troops out. We should never do this. This is awful. It's a terrible thing. It's just amazing that someone like Graham is an expert. Every position he's ever taken has been wrong. It's been boneheaded and wrong. He's always been wrong. When he ran for president, like 3 people voted for him. How is it that this guy continues to dominate the airwaves?
We've talked about foreign policy and what Trump's position is. And we'd sort of like, just continue with the position. Well, when he's doing something right, we'll compliment him. When he's doing something wrong, we'll point it out. But I don't think it's that simple, because it's for us to get him to do something or be on a side to put the pressure on him, to start bringing the troops home. We have to sort of understand, what is his strategy? Does he have a strategy? And of course, we've liked to think that he does have instincts, that we should sympathize with. But if it could be the strategy, well, let's have this thing and then, on again, off again thing, like with Korea, be real tough, then back off. And it might be in his mind, this is good strategy. Keep him off balance and then come through, satisfy both sides. And maybe he'll come out with something favorable in Korea. Maybe he was really believing that, some really great stuff would come from these from these negotiations, and this would be a political benefit for him. But right now, it looks like he's lost here, and even if he'd won, the media would have made sure it looked like a loss. And others say, well, he's unpredictable. He doesn't have any thought for the future. He just does stuff. He shoots from the hip, and he does it on a whim. And all those or none of them could exist, but it's still, if we understand better on what his position really is, why he goes into these negotiations, maybe we'd have a better chance of trying to get the information out of there why we have to come home. Yeah. But because he does have a lot of clout. I don't like what presidents do with executive orders on sanctions and tariffs and all this kind of stuff. But he is in charge as a commander-in-chief, and they have troops on land, and they were there before he became president. He has a lot of authority to move troops around, especially in an undeclared war. So he should be exerting the directives he can give the military are absolutely legitimate, and it could be seen, from my viewpoint, be seen to enhance national security and certainly reduce the killing going on in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And we started out, Bolton and Pompeo were on our headlines, and that's not just to get people to watch the show, although partly. But the fact of the matter is they have aspirations that go well beyond Trump. Trump is just a medium for them to pursue their own political ambitions. Pompeo has it in mind that somehow he's going to be a president someday. He has those aspirations. And Bolton doesn't care who he works for. He would be just as happy doing the same job for Hillary Clinton than he's doing for Donald Trump. He doesn't care about Trump. But Trump has to worry about an election campaign. And this Afghan peace deal was at the centerpiece. See, I delivered on something. I may not have been completely successful elsewhere, but I delivered on this. With this in question now, this is going to politically hurt him. Bolton and Pompeo do not care. They could not care less. And we've supported these talks, not because we think it makes a great sense, because the war was lost before it was even started. But at least if it offers the opportunity to bring some troops home, you start that thing in motion, and that's a positive thing. But with it gone, what happens now? We could not win with 100,000 troops. Right now, there literally is no plan to win. If Trump thinks he's going to gin up the war machine and start another major assault on Afghanistan before the elections, he's mistaken.
That's for sure. You know, whether it was going in 2001 or whether it was backing off from this, the tools that the media uses and the Neocon uses and the enemies of Republican Democratic leadership when they want to get together and do their bidding, it's always fear. Scare the people to death on what would happen. And you remember what the fear was, you know, back in 2001. It was strange that they were able to turn all the fear against the Taliban.
Yeah.
You know, and they had a couple of incidents that, yes, it wasn't like the Afghan or the Al-Qaeda came from Afghanistan.
Yeah.
You know, they came from Saudi Arabia. You know, if they needed an enemy, why did they say, well, you guys, 15 Saudis came over here and bombed us? But that was never done. So it has to be fear, and you can't do that without political leaders going along with it, but then it has to be enhanced and really beat the drums of fear for the people to go along with it. And we sure saw a lot of that for that 1 year before they decided, well, okay, it looks like it's really, now we're making sense. Now we have to go into Iraq. They're the ones.
They're the real
Saddam
ones.
Hussein, he started it all, and he dealt with the Al-Qaeda and the people, the terrorists and all this, to build up fear. And that's a hard thing to combat when it's incessant and you keep thinking, the people, majority-wise, they don't believe the government, they don't trust the government, they don't like the media anymore, and yet they're susceptible to the propaganda.
So
and that's pretty frustrating.
Yeah, that's what makes our days difficult. But the idea that somehow we're going to go back in and do some more is just so bizarre. As you say, the propaganda is strong. I would just close by telling our viewers, if you do get our updates at the Ron Paul Institute, you'll notice that our website was under attack over the weekend. That's why we didn't have any fresh articles. It was a massive attack on the site. It's easy to get a little bit paranoid, Dr. Paul, when you start seeing things like this happen. But we also need to be able to, would like to be able to communicate with you and let you know when things are happening. So if you're not subscribed to the Ron Paul Institute for updates, they're absolutely free. We'll never share or sell your name, and we don't bombard you. We'll just give you, we'll send a few articles, a few updates, a few times a month. Just go to ronpaulinstitute.org/subscribe, and I'll put a link in the description here to join us so we can communicate with you if they decide to pull the plug on us. So,
right.
Thanks.
Very good. You know, it is true paranoia has something to do with this, but when you really give it some consideration, it's not exactly paranoia if it's the truth. You know, if you're realistic, these are real things. It isn't something that we concocted our mind and we imagine it, but we still have to put up with it, and people who are paranoid jump at the opportunity to promote a cause that they believe in, even though it's exactly opposite of what we believe in, which means that we don't think we should be engaged in events like this. And that doesn't mean that we don't care about people, but it's the moral imperative is much stronger for us to mind our own business and let people involved solve the problems rather than taking the so-called American exceptionalism and we know what's best for everybody, get involved in every single fight around the world and pick sides. And then we get a little controversy, so we support both sides. Before you know it, we're fighting both sides. So for practical reasons, there's a good reason for us to just quit the subsidizing and the interference and the intervention overseas and adapt the policy of non-interventionism, which is a moral principle. And if people feel very, very strongly about a fight going on in some place in the world and there are two factions, under our system, we really wouldn't prohibit one from going in and doing what they want, that's at least my position, but that is so much different than when you allow the politicians and the special interest group and the military-industrial complex come in and influence the Congress. Congress, I think, is the least likely place that we're going to see some real resistance to this type of policy. Once you see how the leadership, Republican and Democrats, got behind those who, wanted to make sure that there would be no conference and no negotiations with the Taliban. But anyway, non-interventionism is a great way to go. It's the best for our national security, saves a lot of money, and it's a good way to start if you're interested in the cause of liberty. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.